Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, including Cover 32, Cold Omaha, and Zone Coverage. You know him as Useful Human Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
It's been a very interesting couple days, but starting to get back to normal. Things are getting back into the swing of things everywhere. Both with watching all the college kids come back to my work and thus justifying my hours and pay, and the football is beginning. And we can tell both from the number of listeners we've had and the number of donations that have come in. So, again, thank you, everybody, for helping out with Norse Code and help keeping the Loch Ness Monster at bay. You guys are doing great work out there. Just before we begin, we do have a couple of donations to discuss. A couple of things here. We have a nice PayPal donation from Chris Landwehr. Thank you very much, Chris. We also have something from Don from Ohio, who I checked, and this is actually the first time he has provided any sort of financial help to the show. I feel like he's been, judging from the mailbag question that we'll be answering later, I feel like he's trying to butter us up to try to save him.
Oh, no.
And I kind of said as much to him in a DM earlier. I was like, so just to be certain, because I was like, I could either reveal your full name or I can explain to people that you're just trying to butter us up. He's like, butter us up. So, works. Andrew Springer via Patreon. Again, thank you, Andrew. Joshua Borsma via PayPal, who has a question for us. He asks, with Sam Darnold having a great first preseason game, do you think the Jets will trade Bridgewater after his quality game? If so, which landing spots make for the best situation for Teddy? My top two are the Giants and the Jags for obvious reasons, but I'm sure you immediately understand. I don't think he ends up over at the Jags. I think they are happy with the Blake Bortles facts.
Yeah, they've been popping Bortles for a while. They didn't make any moves for a quarterback. They seem fine. Apparently, He's had a pretty good camp.
They made no move at all. Before any of the chatter went, just like, hey Bortles, you had a great season, kind of. Here, have a truckload of money.
Right. Yeah. So. They seem fine. The Giants make sense because they didn't draft a quarterback when they could have. But you'd be able to, reunite, in a manner of speaking, Teddy with Pat Shurmur. You'd be able to give him a quality receiving core or at least a quality receiver. It kind of depends on what you think of, like Sterling Shepard and so on. But, he'd have Odell Beckham there, and then you'd also have Saquon Barkley there, and then you'd have Evan Ingram there. They have made moves to improve their offensive line. That would be a pretty fun situation for him. Hopefully, you would think for the Giants. They gave Sam Darnold a bunch of reps with the ones in the past couple of days, it sounds like. So Darnold might just leapfrog all the quarterbacks and just be the starter, in which case you've got a veteran backup in Josh McCown and a backup who seems to be playing at a starting quality level that's been earning rave reviews all offseason, although those may be planted, in Teddy Bridgewater.
Or in the case of, Vikings Twitter, everyone is still just rooting for him to succeed and willing to ignore any sort of flaw.
Yeah, I mean, as is appropriate.
As was the style at the time.
Right. So I think really what's most likely to happen is not that a team with a bad quarterback is going to trade for him, although that would make a lot of sense. I think it's going to be a team that sees their quarterback go down that would trade for him, except for the Cardinals, who already have Josh Rosen. So when Sam Bradford goes down, they'll be fine with Rosen.
Which isn't necessarily a comment on Bradford's leg. It's actually more of a legs. It's more of a comment on the injury history of Arizona quarterbacks at this point.
That's true too. Jesus.
Just not to badmouth Bradford, but these things just seem to happen out in Arizona. There's just something in the water out there. It just turns people rotten, or it just ruins their ACLs. It's one or the other.
Right. But yeah, so I think they will try to trade him. They've been basically signaling that they want to trade him for a while. Now, one of the problems with a lot of these articles about like the Jets are open to trading Teddy Bridgewater is like, A, that's not new news. They've been open since they signed him. Basically, like they paid like $5 million to see if they can get a second round pick out of him or something. But B, most of the articles, it's really funny. The writer's actually not saying that they're shopping him or anything, which is kind of what's been implied. It's just like, my sense is that the Jets either want to start him or trade him, maybe. They're like, it's all like probabilistic, wishy-washy language in the articles. And then you see like, an aggregator like Pro Football Talk will like tweet it out and be like, Jets are trading Teddy. And you're like, what? That's not what the article. Fine. But yeah, Teddy's probably going to get traded, especially if Darnold starts, which it sounds like they're on the path to doing.
Well, it's not like the Jets have ever had a bad history with USC quarterbacks or anything.
Yeah, I can't imagine that going wrong.
Not in the least. And finally, Kevin Sayer via PayPal. Again, thanks, Kevin. Saying thanks for the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. So thank you guys so much for donating. Again, anything that you give to the show goes directly toward the show and fun projects that we have looking forward. So again, thanks so much. If you would like to help keep the show ad-free and help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, you can do it in one of two different ways. You can go to paypal.me/Norse Code, and you can donate there. That is, of course, a one-time donation. Or you can go to patreon.com/Norse Code and become a sustaining member, much like an NPR pledge drive. You can do $1, Tree Fitty. Tree Fitty tends to be a kind of a popular one, although we did get a donation via Patreon for $3.51, which I appreciated. You're going the extra mile there, kids. So kudos to you. But you can go to paypal.me/Norse Code or patreon.com/Norse Code to donate. So again, thank you guys so much. A couple things before we begin. This is the last week to get your fantasy football information to me, basically. This is the last week that we will be taking people in for the lottery, and we have quite a number of people. I think we're at about 60 people fighting for 10 spots. So if you have not had a chance yet, you can go to, you can email us at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com, and you can send an email there, and that will get you into the lottery, and just say, I'd like into the fantasy football lottery. Or you can just send a quick DM to the Norse Code Twitter account, and that will work just as well. So I'm going to start collecting those here in a sec, and Saturday night at midnight will be when that is done. So please get that in, and I will notify people as soon as I get off my butt and do the lottery. I think I'm going to randomize it 84 times in honor of Mr. Randy Moss. I have this feeling that Don from Ohio is going to end up getting in and spending the entire season making fun of me for not getting a win yet. So I'm really looking forward to that.
What could possibly give you that idea?
I know, right? It's not like there's any sort of precedent. I saw the tweet earlier about the Cleveland Browns and the beer that's like that's supposed to like the machines that
the
are
victory fridge.
Yeah, the victory fridges that are all over Cleveland for their first win. I mean, like I kind of feel like I should install those in my home for the first fantasy football win for the Norse Code League over the past year and some change. So I'm considering it. I have not gotten corporate sponsorship. If I get corporate sponsorship, I kind of have to go through with it. So, all that aside, again, thank you guys so much for participating in the show, for helping out, for giving word to the show, for following us on Twitter, any sort of interaction. Again, we really do appreciate it. All of that said, let's get into the show and talk about the Vikings triumphing over the Denver Broncos. That was a pretty good first series. Most of it was done in the way of Latavius Murray runs, but that was a pretty nice series by Cousins and the Vikings.
Yeah, it didn't seem like there was any mistake from the quarterback or the skill position players in any of, I guess, just their 8 snaps on the drive. But 4 excellent throws from Kirk, 4 catches from, the people in position to receive them. Stephon Diggs 3 of those times. Great runs from Latavius Murray. Some kind of questions about the offensive line. They weren't really out there long enough for you to be like, that's a problem. But there was pressure that was given up by both tackles, for example, on the Kirk touchdown. But yeah, I would say generally just a really good series for the offense. Being able to score right away, that's cool. Haven't seen that in a long time for the Vikings. Just like opening drive stuff. But yeah, I think that's a good sign. Obviously, with more time comes more exposure to some of the things that Cousins could theoretically have trouble with. But he was able to play to the game plan that the Vikings put forth, which I'm told they had like a script, not a game plan. But he was able to like process his reads and execute them correctly, which is his strength. And you ended up with 2 beautiful throws, one to Diggs on a fade on the sideline, which was just over Courtney Roby, which was just amazing. And, the Diggs catch was equally amazing. And then he had a really good red zone throw where he was able to kind of rifle it in on a slant when Diggs got open. So really good series from the offense, but obviously not enough to make any conclusions about, the offensive line, which, out of those 8 snaps probably struggled on a couple of them, or Cousins. We already know that, Diggs is good. We know that Thielen is good. He didn't get a target, and that's fine. Latavius Murray looked really good, which is exciting and new, so more of that. Not that I thought he was kind of underrated for the first half of the season anyway, but not that he was bad last year, but that was really nice running from Latavius. So we're gonna have to wait till we see more from Cousins. But what we saw in the game was really fantastic.
It was pretty promising to watch, especially the spectacular catch by Diggs. That was it was the sort of thing that you probably wouldn't have seen from Case Keenum, and the placement was spot on, albeit it did look more like a circus catch than anything else.
Yeah, it took a bit of doing for Diggs to haul that one in, which is why I didn't go out of my way, I guess, to compliment the throw, because I tweeted out a GIF and I was like, "What a catch!" because it was an amazing catch, and people were like, "Arif, but the throw," and it was a really good throw. I don't want to take it away, but it's not like it was perfect, right? He put it in a place where only the receiver could get it, so it's like a positively graded throw. If I was PFF, I'd give it like a +1 or +1.5 or something like that. But the catch was pretty spectacular from Diggs. But yeah, it's all good stuff. We saw him in the red zone, which is one of the areas where he's been criticized, and he executed basically immediately. We saw him under pressure, which is where he's been criticized, and we saw him execute there. Now I kind of want to see what happens when the game plan kind of goes awry, the receivers are covered, he has to be off rhythm or something like that. And we'll probably see that in the 3rd preseason game, if not the 2nd.
So a couple of people on Vikings Twitter were remarking that the red zone series was a little bit, what's the term they used? A little bit of lacking in like imagination. That it seemed incredibly bland. Like it was 2 runs up the gut and then trying on a pass. What did you feel, or how did you feel about how they approached the red zone?
Yeah, I don't really care.
They scored.
Well,
screw Vikings Twitter.
That part's important, but also it's it's the preseason. They don't want to give too much away, and being able to test out what your goal line offense can do is really important. It turns out not, I guess, an extraordinary amount, but that's fine. I think it's important to just kind of get the base plays in there. So it's fine that it was uninventive in terms of 2 runs up the gut before passing on essentially double slants, which I guess Treadwell was super open because of a Thielen rub route. But yeah, that's fine. It's the preseason. If it's uninventive during the season where the play calling will likely be more innovative, then that's a problem. But and it's not like running up the gut is a thing you should never do, which is, I think, kind of the implication that one can walk away with when you see a bunch of criticisms of the way that the red zone operates. And so I would shy away from criticizing the play selection of 2 of the 3 plays that they've had in the red zone thus far, because running up the gut is one of a number of options. And the issue is if you run up the gut way too often, like a lot of offensive coordinators do. If you run it twice, it's not that often. It doesn't matter.
I have a theory as to
yeah.
why people freaked out about this. It's because early in the broadcast they showed Bill Musgrave. And immediately into the back of their heads, lying dormant for a couple of years now.
It's like a priming effect.
Exactly. All of a sudden you have confirmation bias. Like, oh my God, I see Bill Musgrave on the sideline with a little note card. Is he calling our plays again? I don't remember reading that he... I thought default... Wait, who's calling our...
Oh no.
Oh no, this is... I want to wake up. Guard, let me out. It was interesting listening to the because the version of the game that I watched, because I wasn't able to watch it live. The version of the game I watched was with the Denver announcers, which actually included SportsCenter's Steve Levy for some reason.
Sure.
Turns out not that bad at play-by-play.
Really?
Yeah, it was actually kind of enjoyable. In that way that you kind of expected the game to wrap up quickly because you're used to him doing SportsCenter clips. But just saying. But it was interesting that they kept pointing out that the rookie corner was the one getting picked on all this. And not that they were saying that this was like a bad move. It was like Kirk Cousins with a veteran decision there to pick on the rookie corner there. It's like, yeah, that actually is a good idea. It's like that's not wrong. Good for him. That when people were complaining about it being like uninventive or whatever, it's like, yeah, but he played smart football there, and especially for the toss, he found the rookie corner, and it was a terrible matchup on him, so he took advantage. It was 1-on-1.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. Let's also talk about. Well, since we're talking about first series, let's talk about the play by Case Keenum against the Vikings number ones, and boy, that was a lot of 3-and-outs that they ended up getting out of that.
Yeah, they actually only had 3 plays against the first team. The next 3-and-out was actually against the second team,
and even the second team shut them down.
Yeah, so whoops. Not that I'm like taking like kind of like this like satisfaction that Keenum is doing poorly. He actually apparently is having a really wonderful camp with the Broncos. It's more just like, yeah, I mean the defense is pretty good, huh? He didn't do a great job. We saw a couple of those accuracy issues. We saw a hospital ball. I didn't pay as much attention to Keenum. But obviously the fact that they only had 1 first down in the entire game or in the entire first half, is fairly telling. I think that stat might not count the Royce Freeman touchdown, which really is like 2 first downs, honestly. I think from the way that people keep statistics, touchdowns for first downs. So yeah, that's pretty telling, and you end up with a lot of 3-and-outs. And the Vikings defense, who are fairly familiar with Case Keenum's proclivities, did a pretty good job, making sure that he was under pressure, which is something that he's kind of excelled at. But also, he held onto the ball too long, which is something we're kind of familiar with, and he invited pressure. The passes were a little high, which we're kind of used to too. But yeah, I mean, he didn't look wonderful or anything like that.
Let's take a moment and talk about the kickoff, the punt rather, that was a return for a touchdown. It really did feel like the Vikings special teams was in mid-season form at that moment.
Yeah, it really was, and that one was pretty frustrating. A lot of it happens because Holton Hill jumps out of his lane as a punt gunner on his assignment for really not much of a reason at all, which kind of sucks for Hill because he's probably going to end up being in competition for that 6th cornerback spot. And if you're the 6th cornerback, you are like a first-team special teamer. Like that is your job now, and maybe in week 18, which doesn't exist, they'll call on you to play. But for now, you're a first-team special teamer, so he can't make those kinds of mistakes, and that was the biggest mistake. Also, Isaiah McKenzie is wicked fast, so that helped. And we saw a missed tackle here and there from the Vikings, but I'm not too concerned that like Quigley missed a tackle, like, yeah, he's the punter. That's like almost his job.
It's probably better that he missed the tackle and didn't get hurt in
Right,
the preseason.
Yeah, it's a good job, good effort. You don't have to do that again. That sort of thing, right? So yeah, I don't like love it, and it tells you something about sort of what's at stake for the bottom of the roster, and whether or not Holton Hill can kind of hold on to that spot. But yeah, I mean, it was a pretty disastrous looking special teams touchdown. There was another linebacker on the play. I've forgotten his name. I don't think it's Rashard Cliette. Might be Ben Gideon, who also screwed up on that play. But primarily it's Holton Hill.
Damn you, Holton Hill. So let's talk about the big stars of the game. I believe that the kind of name that has kind of rung out over the game is Mr. Rock Thomas.
Yeah, Rock Thomas had a really spectacular game. Bunch of big runs, a huge screen that he took to the house, a couple of touchdowns, one receiving touchdown, the other one, I guess, a receiving touchdown because it was a screen pass. Yeah, he got open on a wheel route. That didn't look like it was enormously difficult to get open on, but, good catch on a good throw, and, he deserves credit for that. The screen was great. He was patient enough to let the blocks kind of develop in front of him, and then he turned on the second gear and was able to run away from a defense that was just not set up for a screen. It was like the perfect call, and he benefited a little bit from that. And his running was really spectacular. One of the things that kind of shows up when you watch his Jacksonville State stuff is, he has a lot of great balance and has the ability to kind of shed tackles that come in at awkward angles. We saw a lot of that in this game. And actually, the more impressive, so when he had what is it officially, a 72-yard touchdown catch and run?
I believe it was 72 yards, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. So on that very same series, he actually had, in my opinion, a more impressive play, which is he should have been tackled in the backfield for like a loss of 3 or 4, and he ends up turning it into like a gain of 6, and that was like the play immediately prior to it. And that's something that is really nice to see in a running back. And thus far, I think it puts him kind of ahead of everybody else in the competition for running back 3, because we don't have a lot of evaluation where a running back is actually going up against people who are allowed to tackle them. And so when we do have that situation, one running back kind of just ridiculously outshines the others, that's kind of where you're at. So yeah, and he had a really spectacular game.
I was saving this for later, but you had a bit of a Twitter moment when somebody transcribed the comment about Mike Hughes and how you believe that he has the possibility he could be one of the best corners as far as rookies go in the league. I believe you even said Defensive Player of the Year. Or is that defensive rookie? Defensive rookie, yeah. My bad. But so in this game of Defend Your Take, how did you feel he did in his first preseason game?
I thought he did spectacularly. He was only targeted once. That target was nearly an interception. The receiver had to turn into a defensive back. I actually had to watch that target a couple of times, not because I was like, oh, this is the only Mike Hughes rep I get to watch, time to evaluate, but because I was trying to determine whether or not he was actually, in the right spot, because the receiver got ahead of him to the ball, right? Like the positioning is that the receiver was inside, where the ball was, and Mike Hughes was to the outside. And so I was like, well, maybe, it was almost an interception because he lost coverage and he got kind of lucky. And I just wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. And it really wasn't the case. He actually ran the route for the receiver, and then he turned his head to see where the ball was, and then started tracking the ball as if he was the receiver. And so he was in a perfect spot to catch the ball, and the receiver had to turn it into the defensive back and bat the ball out of the air, which is why I think PFF misinterpreted that, and I think that's why PFF gave him a poor grade, because they only had one target to grade, and he only gets a small bonus then, therefore, on all of the other coverage snaps where he wasn't a target, and those are just normalized. Like if you don't get targeted in PFF system, it's the same kind of small boost to your grade that comes from the normalization process as if you had completely stuck to the receiver than if you had completely lost the receiver and the quarterback just didn't look your way. Now, over 1,000 snaps in a season, over 600 coverage snaps, that'll all even out. And so I don't really have like a problem with that. But this game grade looks a little bit wonky because I think they misgraded the play where he almost got the interception, because I think they thought he was out of position, which is why the receiver got his hand on the ball instead of in a position where the receiver had to turn into a defensive back. So I thought, with that in mind, then he didn't really make a mistake that you could see from the broadcast footage. He did a really great job staying with receivers, recognizing routes, knowing when to pass routes off, which is very difficult for a rookie cornerback, and something Mike Zimmer mentioned today in a media scrum about one of the things that he's just really ahead on. Mike Zimmer has been really effusive in his praise for Hughes. And one of the things that he talks about, so he talks about a lot of things, right? He talks about his agility, his ability to cut, his ability to break on the ball, his ball skills, his, eyes. But one of the things that it feels like Zimmer is the most impressed by is not Hughes's physical skills, which are all fairly like tremendous once you get to see them in person and watch, what he can do with his hips when he's covering a receiver, even from the broadcast footage. But what seems to impress Zimmer the most is how quickly Hughes has picked everything up. And this is one of the more complicated defenses for a defensive back to pick up. And so for him to be able to understand kind of in what scenarios he has to pass, a receiver off to a linebacker, or if he has to stay with that receiver, or, this, that, and the other thing, and what the coverage rules are, which can change actually fairly frequently within the Vikings defense itself, that has been, kind of a big sticking point. And to see him cover so well, to see him pick up the defense so quickly, to see him, play with those physical skills, yeah, if he gets 1,000 snaps, I think he deserves mention for Defensive Rookie of the Year. Because, obviously he has to play those 1,000 snaps really well, but I think he's on track for that. So I'm glad that take got out there, and then the preseason game happened, and he played extraordinarily well, and then Mike Zimmer was like, "Wow, we got a kid." Like that makes me feel better.
Arif can go back to geniusing on Twitter again.
Yeah, I stand on an Adam Thielen take from like 4 years ago, lived off of that for a couple of years. Now I can stand on a Mike Hughes take, which, I'm like, oh, this first round pick's going to be good. But still, I'm going to take credit for it.
I just imagine you opening up Twitter to your mentions and just like looking at your phone going, feed me.
Right.
I need more. So who else stood out as far as offensive members of the team? Who else kind of stood out for you as far as kind of outplaying their position?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about that. But first I want to clarify, my Adam Thielen take from 4 years ago was not that he would turn into a Pro Bowl receiver. It was that he should be the fifth receiver on the roster over like Rodney Smith. That wasn't that good.
Meanwhile, you and Dusty tossed every bit of shade my way when I had declared in our season preview last year that Adam Thielen was going to make the Pro Bowl, and both of you just went, big surprise, that's not a surprise idea that Thielen is going to perform well in this sort of season. It's like, meanwhile, by the end of it, it was like, yeah, so I told you guys that this was going to be a thing. All right, so who stood out on the offense?
Sure. So obviously, Rock Thomas. But aside from that, I thought Stacey Coley looked really good as a receiver. Unfortunately, he got injured again. He's had like a week of being healthy all off season. Like he got injured early in OTAs, and then he finally came back, had a really great week, and then he got injured again. But during that week, he looked really good. So credit where credit's due. He had a really good preseason game. I think he only got 2 targets for like 23 yards. But for the most part, he actually looked good even on routes where he wasn't targeted. On the offensive line, it's definitely worth pointing out that Brian O'Neill had a really great game. PFF gave him a low run blocking grade, but a high pass blocking grade. And I would say his run blocking was actually pretty good too. This is so weird. I'm usually so pessimistic, even during the preseason. Like I'm like, Sam Bradford's not throwing past the sticks. Case Keenum is awful. Oh no, Taylor Heineke's also awful.
No, you declared it last episode. This is the season of Upbeat Arif, and apologies if this causes you to not appreciate the show as much, fellow listeners, or if this causes our Patreon donations to suddenly drop. Arif is in a good place right now, and frankly, as his co-host, it scares me.
I just want to say, given how cynical and pessimistic I am about people and players and things, and how easy it is to talk about the problems that a player has and the holes in their game, it should be meaningful then when I say, like, Mike Hughes is playing extraordinarily well. Because I didn't like the Trey Waynes pick. I didn't like the Mike Hughes pick. But Trey Waynes was playing poorly in the preseason and in training camp, and people are like, Arif, you're biased, right? And then it turned out he ended up playing poorly for like 2.5 years. And so even if I was biased, at least I ended up correct. If I am similarly biased, then it should be very meaningful that Mike Hughes looks really good, right? Because I thought they should have traded out, or if they did draft Mike Hughes, they should have, moved an asset to trade up for like Connor Williams, who had apparently just merely an okay looking preseason thus far, and so on and so forth. So that should be meaningful. And, at some point we can kind of answer the question, and I've kind of already answered it a little bit in the previous podcast, to what extent, how well does Mike Hughes have to perform before you're okay accepting that they drafted a cornerback above, position in need when they clearly didn't need a cornerback. So, and we'll revisit that later. But yeah, and it should be noted, I did not like the Brian O'Neill pick. So the Hughes pick I didn't like for strategic reasons. I at least thought he was a good player. The O'Neill pick I didn't like because I didn't think he was all that good of a player. But also because it was like kind of a substitute. And honestly, most of my criticism of O'Neill came from the perception that he was a first-round pick. And so getting him in the second round was still a value and stuff like that, but I couldn't be enthused about it. But he is way ahead of his development curve, and he looks really good, and I think that he should play instead of Rashad Hill. And with the way Hill's availability has been looking for the Vikings, maybe they'll be forced into that decision than being able to make that decision. But there you go. But O'Neill looks really good. Other offensive players that look good, Caleb Jones looked good briefly. I thought Aviance Collins looked good, but not as good as he has during camp. He looked decent, I think, in the preseason game that he played in. And then, I'm trying to think. Oh, Cornelius Edison, that's worth mentioning. If he's the backup center and he's forced to play, you're in a position where, maybe he's actually a lot better than he was in Chicago and then what we kind of perceived him to be. So that's worth mentioning. Unfortunately, aside from David Morgan, not a lot from the tight ends. I'm still kind of surprised that Cousins and Rudolph haven't been able to connect all that much in camp or in that preseason game, given I've always kind of taken the stance that this narrative, and this is mostly a fantasy football narrative and less like a covering sports and watching football to watch football narrative. But there's been this thing about how because John DeFilippo loved targeting tight ends like Trey Burton as well as, Zach Ertz, and how Cousins loved targeting tight ends, Jordan Reed and Vernon Davis, that the tight end targets should kind of explode this year for the Vikings and in particular for Kyle Rudolph. And I always thought, that's silly. Trey Burton is crazy talented. He just got starting money for being that talented. Hey, Vernon Davis was like a first-round pick and a physical freak, and he was the second tight end on the roster, and he still looked pretty good even though he was old. And Jordan Reed is just a great receiving tight end. I don't think you've got a second receiving tight end, and I think that and you don't have targets as good as Stephon Diggs or Adam Thielen. So I didn't think it ever made sense, but I'm also just surprised that given the reputation that Cousins and Rudolph haven't been connecting all that much, especially because Cousins was like, I love throwing to Kyle. It's like throwing to a mattress. He's enormous. It's hard to miss. And then he hasn't been using that impressive catch radius. He always throws to Kyle, a little bit too low or a little bit too close to defenders when he doesn't really have to, given just this impressive reach that Rudolph has. So I can't say much about Rudolph because I would like to see them use his actual catch radius. But I thought David Morgan looked really good in the game. And that's worth pointing out too. Hill struggled. Reef kind of struggled, but not as much as he did in camp. He actually looked okay. Compton struggled a lot. Isadora looked all right to pretty good, somewhere between there. Those are kind of the offensive players that stood out to me. And I wrote a whole article with much more detailed observations where I don't have to work off of memory, but I can work off of notes. That's over at zonecoverage.com. We'll link that in the show notes. And hopefully I'll have a defensive version of that article up very soon. I've been kind of dragging my feet on it. But yeah, it's got notes for basically every offensive player, how they performed in the preseason game and how they've performed to camp up until that point. So hopefully that'll give you a more coherent and concise set of details about what I've said.
Aw. So there really is a companion piece to the podcast, and you can access it behind the paywall at zonecoverage.com. So let's talk defense then. Defense looked good. Other than the special team kind of wonkiness, what takeaways do we have as far as the defense is concerned in this game?
Well, it looks good. There's not a ton of takeaways other than that. The problem is that, of course, we only got 3 snaps, the first team defense. I think Danielle Hunter got a pressure on that snap. That's cool. We didn't get to see Everson Griffin play. We saw Brian Robinson play. We saw Sheldon Richardson play. We didn't see Linval Joseph play. But, I mean, it looked good. Xavier Rhodes looked good. Trey Waynes looked fine. Harrison Smith looked great. Just assume that. But I didn't really get to evaluate Kendrick Sutton that much because of the 3-snap thing. But, yeah, so far so good. We'll see more when we see more. In camp, the defense has been ahead of the offense, which is something you'd expect from the number 1 or number 2 defense from 2017, depending on what measure you use. Probably number 1 if you take into account, the likelihood of like turnover regression and stuff like that. And also, a new offense, and also what you'd expect based off of the fact that apparently this always happens in the offseason, although I'm not super confident that that's the case, but whatever. 3 reasons that the defense should be ahead of the offense, and it turns out they are. So from a depth perspective, the takeaways that we can get, Marcus Sherrills is like a really good cornerback, and we never give him enough credit for that. Even on the show where I've argued that he's actually been a good cornerback for 3 years, and we just kind of assume he's not. But he looked really good again. Which is great. Holton Hill as a corner did not look as good as the hype early in the offseason was. And honestly, Hill has tailed off in the last week. Before the game had even started, he had just kind of tailed off. He'd been allowing a couple more receptions. He'd been letting receivers kind of get away from him in coverage and stuff like that. And he just hasn't looked as good over this past week as he had in the first week of camp, or apparently, which I wasn't there for, OTAs, which fine, I guess. He's an undrafted rookie. But, there's this question, will he pass through waivers? And you just have to remember that because he wasn't drafted, and there's going to be people who were drafted that were cut, there's a really good chance that he'll survive waivers. Now, people claim players that weren't drafted off the waiver wire, not all the time, but it's happened. I think what the Vikings claimed like a guard, like Mark Asper was his name from a while ago. That was like undrafted, right? But for the most part, the players that get claimed off of waivers are usually drafted because another team coveted them, which is why they were drafted instead of be an undrafted free agent. So that's something to think about, that maybe he actually does not have a spot on the roster with how well Marcus Sherrills is playing. Hughes, obviously, we talked about him. He looked great. Craig James, I'm kind of surprised, looked pretty good. He's been kind of quiet in camp, but this last week he's looked decent to pretty good. And then in the game, I thought he did all right. At linebacker, we saw, kind of a highlight play from Rashard Cliette. We saw a pretty bad play from Kentrell Brothers. I thought Eric Wilson did all right. At safety, Jack Tocho, he of the 90.6 PFF grade or something. That one's weird. This is where I should talk a little bit about, PFF grades. So I had a couple of tweets about this. I think the problem is not in PFF's grading or evaluation of players. I think the problem is in the presentation of that grade. And I've actually had some discussions with PFF about this, not about Jack Tocho specifically. I wasn't like, hey, what's going on? This is a thought I had before I even saw, his really impressive grade where he ended up being one of the top 2 safeties in the preseason from their grading system. The problem is when you translate plus minus grades, which I think are super useful, into 0 to 100 grades, which are not useful. To be generous, not useful. And one of the problems is that our perception of any sort of bounded system, especially when it goes up to 100, like a Madden rating or like your literal like grade in high school or something, our perception is that if you get a 100, you were perfect. And that is a totally like fair perception based off of like how we're socialized and what it means to get 100 out of 100. It means you didn't make any friggin' mistakes, right? But that doesn't like that's not how a plus minus system would work. There's always an opportunity to increase your grade. There's always an opportunity to decrease your grade. And this is important. There's definitely an opportunity for you to have a positive grade and make a ton of big mistakes. And that makes sense in a plus minus system, and it does not make sense in a 0 to 100 system. And Tocho had a lot of really good plays. He contributed to one interception by helping deflect a pass that Anthony Harris caught. He caught another interception. I think he made one more pretty good play. And interceptions are worth more than twice what touchdowns cost. Touchdowns are worth essentially 20 yards. Interceptions are worth essentially 45 yards going in the other direction. So statistically, it's cool that, you know, he got an interception even though he allowed 2 touchdowns. Now that's all situational and stuff like that. But if he had gotten like a plus 2.5 grade, I think it would be a lot less controversial that he ended up with a positive grade in that game than the fact that he got like a 90.6, which means like maybe he made a small mistake, but mostly perfect game. And he made 2 huge mistakes. He just had 2 huge plays to make up for it. So that's weird. And Tocho had a very up and down game, and that's the best way to characterize it. We shouldn't say he had necessarily a bad game. It started really poorly, and first impressions are really powerful. But we should also note that he did some really positive things that helped him. So he allowed 2 touchdowns, both of them when he was kind of playing as a cornerback, even though he was like on a running back for one of them. And he was just basically a safety and man coverage. He was basically playing as a cornerback, which is not the position that the Vikings are going to ask him to play if he makes the roster. It does lower his value, right? Because he was drafted as a cornerback, but maybe you can't play him at cornerback in the NFL, so that reduces his versatility. But you can't play Sendejo or Harrison Smith at cornerback either. So, whatever. So he gave up 2 touchdowns as a cornerback, and they look really bad. One of them, maybe it was a rotation error from the person that was supposed to be up top. But if he's playing cornerback, there's only one safety. So it's unlikely that the outside receiver, which, again, it's a running back, will have a safety rotate over top of them. So it's probably not a rotation error, but that's worth looking into. He had a pretty up and down game, and he showcased some of the stuff that he's really good at. He made a really good read on the ball in order to get that interception. And he showcased what he's bad at, man coverage, I guess. So if you only evaluate him for the stuff that he might only be asked to do if he replaces Sendejo or something like that, that's really good. He actually had a good game because you're not going to ask Sendejo to cover a man all that often on the outside. So if you take a look at what he did in the box, really good. But that's not to say this isn't the kind of performance that he wouldn't get cut because of. It's just to say we should, A, not think about that PFF grade because it's just presented poorly, and B, think about what he would be asked to do for the Vikings. And that hit he laid over the middle that led to the Anthony Harris interception, great. That's a Sendejo move. That's great.
A very, very Sendejo move.
Yeah. So we should think about Tocho like that. So yeah, those are maybe my thoughts. I didn't even talk about defensive linemen. Not that this podcast hasn't gone on long enough, but defensive linemen. It would have been nice to see Afadio Denibo or Odenabo in with the 2s instead of waiting with the 3s. I thought he played really well. I thought Tayshaun Bauer played really, really well. I think that he's probably on the verge of being better than Brian Robinson, if not better than Robinson himself. I've already written that in my notebook. And so he should be at some point during the season the 3rd defensive end instead of the 4th one, out of deference to Robinson. Maybe they won't do that, but still, he looks really good. He looked really good in that game. But yeah, Jaleel Johnson hasn't excelled. He didn't look bad, which is good, but he also didn't look great. David Perry looked really good as a nose tackle, which is kind of surprising because, not a lot of people expected a lot from him. Those are things to consider. Stephen Weatherly, kind of whatever. Ade Aruna, worse. Jonathan Wynn, kind of interesting.
I was going to say, who was a disappointment to their mother this week?
Ade Aruna, because his mother's an immigrant.
Really? That's where you want with that?
My mom's an immigrant. I can say that. No, actually, I would say defensively, Holden Hill, of course. I didn't see a ton from Horace Richardson. Not that I would necessarily criticize that. Trey Matthews, Tocho maybe. Defensively, even up until like the fourth quarter, they mostly looked good. Craig James looked fine. Trevon Mathis, I guess, looked pretty poor. So that's worth noting. Kentrell Brothers looked pretty poor. I already mentioned that. Antoine Williams can't cover, so there's that.
So let's move on to camp. What observations has there been over the last couple of days of camp, kind of in the wake of the game?
Yeah, Treadwell has looked really good in the red zone. Again, he didn't get that many targets in the game. 1 target for 3 yards and like 40 snaps, which is like the most Treadwell thing ever. But he looked really good in the red zone in camp. And he scored 2 touchdowns against Trey Waynes. And on at least one of them, if not both of them, but definitely one of them, Waynes was in good coverage and contesting the catch and all that. So I wouldn't even blame it on Waynes. The other one, maybe you could. But yeah, Treadwell looked good then. Like I said, Holton Hill's kind of dropped off. Mike Hughes continues to look really good. He took some reps with the ones today. Stacey Cohen looked really good until he got hurt. Kendall Wright finally had a good day. He's mostly just had bad days. Cousins has really struggled in situational drills. And this is the thing that might concern me the most. And this is worth kind of putting into a note somewhere, but for now it's on a podcast. I don't think Kirk Cousins has succeeded in like a single situational drill in all of camp. And if he has, it was never during a 2-minute drill. He has failed every single 2-minute drill that he's had in camp. There have been 4 days where they've had 2-minute drills. And on those 4 days, they've done a couple of 2-minute drills, and he's failed in all of them. So that's a problem that I'm worried about. That's really concerning. It might just be getting familiar with the players, getting familiar with the offense. But if he's not familiar with them now, it's a fair question to ask when he will be and if that will impact the Vikings kind of early on in the season. So that's definitely worth noting. And he's had problems like, converting third downs and stuff like that. But we don't see a ton of those situations in camp like we used to. So yeah, that's those are notes kind of off the top of my head. Oh, Chad Beebe has finally come along. I think he looked really poor in the first couple of days of camp all the way through the first week. And then this past week, he's looked really good. So that's worth noting. God, I wish Zylstra was healthy too. So yeah, those are.
So what happened?
Thoughts.
What happened at camp involving the resurrection of players who then, because there were a lot of GIFs out there that were implying some interesting things.
Yeah. Okay. So Rashad Hill took a tumble in 11s and just stayed on the ground for like a minute, 2 minutes, while the trainers attended to him. He wasn't getting up. That looks pretty bad. Most of the time that happens, they're injured for some period of time. And then the cart comes out. That's even worse. And gets put on the cart and it gets carted away. 17 minutes later, I know this because I tweeted it and I looked at the timestamps of both tweets. 17 minutes later, he comes back out and he's walking and he's got his pads on and his helmet in his hand. And you're like, oh, okay. So he doesn't need to be in the athletic trainer's facility. So he doesn't need to be treated. But is he still going to take snaps? And he had to wait because they were doing like individual drills and it wasn't his turn. And then the individual drills ended. So they go back to 11s and you had to wait for everybody to get organized. And then he takes snaps of the ones, right? In a full contact drill. Okay. So he's fine. So yeah, Twitter took a roller coaster and came out the worse for wear on the other side. But there were also players that just got hurt. Stacey Coley just got hurt. Jalen Holmes got hurt, I think. Yeah, and so it was a bunch of injuries in one day, and that it makes for panic. Honestly, the Vikings, if you take a look at all the teams throughout the league and the injuries they've suffered in training camp and stuff like that, the Vikings have not had that many important players get hurt.
We're not the Chargers.
Right. It's definitely not the Chargers, not the Packers. The only starters that have gotten hurt were the ones that entered camp already hurt. That's Pat Elflein. Obviously, Mike Remmers got hurt, but it sounds like he's already back. He did limited participation yesterday, did limited participation today. So he'll just be back. So yeah, I'm jinxing it now. I'm sorry, guys. But from the perspective of evaluating it against the rest of the league, the Vikings have fewer players hurt, and they've got fewer players in a position to make an impact that are hurt. So yeah, it sucks that Coley's hurt. We're thinking about him as like a fourth receiver, right? It sucks that Jalen Holmes is hurt. Until that preseason game, I thought it was kind of likely that he might be on the chopping block as a fourth-round pick because he hasn't moved up the depth chart from the third string, and he didn't look all that good. He flashed a lot. He's got a lot of strength, but he just got washed out on a ton of plays too. So, I mean, I don't want players to get hurt, but if I'm picking between like Sheldon Richardson and Jalen Holmes, I'm sorry. It would be Jalen Holmes. So the Vikings had a lot of players get hurt. They did not have that many important players to get hurt. Rashad Hill obviously got hurt. He came back. Hill didn't practice today. It was also not that important of a practice. They didn't even wear pads for it. And like I said, O'Neal should be starting ahead of him, in my opinion. So yeah, that's there was just a spate of injuries, and it just felt bad tweeting them all out. But in the end, like, Coley's been healthy for 4 days this offseason, and I'm exaggerating, a week. And Holmes is not expected to make an impact this year. And I was talking to someone about Holmes's preseason in light of Mike Zimmer's comments that I thought Holmes played well, not as well as PFF graded him. And I think maybe this is kind of like a Derek Cox situation. Now, if people don't remember, Derek Cox, who's a former Baltimore Raven, was in camp for the Vikings, I think in 2014, Zimmer's first year. And he was making all kinds of plays. In camp, he had a ton of interceptions. In the preseason, I think he had one or two. He was rolling with the ones in a lot of situations, rolling with the twos in most situations. And he just looked really good. He looked like a lock to make the roster. And this is back when we had 2 rounds of cuts, and he got cut in the first round of cuts, not even the second. And it just kind of reminds me that it's not necessarily how you perform, although that plays a role. It's how you perform within the constraints of doing what you're asked to do. And Cox would freelance a lot and not do what the scheme was asking him to do. And I'm getting the sense that maybe that's kind of what happened to Holmes, that the way he was attacking the quarterback and the way that he was approaching the offensive line was not in line with what necessarily was being asked of him. So the fact that he got two hurries and a hit and a sack or whatever, maybe that's not as important as, kind of how we went about it. And I'm getting the sense that maybe he didn't necessarily go about it the right way, which isn't to say he's going to get cut as soon as possible or anything like that, or even that actually happened. But the fact that Zimmer was reticent about complimenting him, even though he just wouldn't stop complimenting someone like Mike Hughes. And Holmes is a Zimmer pick too. It's not like he's more invested in Hughes or anything like that. I mean, he had trouble complimenting Waynes in his rookie year. I think maybe speaks to something along those lines. So I still don't have a ton of high hopes for Hughes. It'd be really surprising if he got cut. Throughout the NFL, if you took all 32 teams together and you stacked all their 4th-round picks, only one gets cut every 2 years. It's pretty rare. So when Willie Beavers got cut, that was pretty rare. I remember the Browns cut a 4th-round receiver. I forget his name, Jordan Lasley or something like that. Maybe not. That's the name of a receiver. Maybe it's not that guy. But he got cut, and that was embarrassing for the Browns because it's a 4th-round pick. So it's pretty rare. And so I'd be surprised if he got cut. But at the same time, I wouldn't be stunned, right? Because he's like a third-team defensive lineman.
So this week we have shared practices with the Jags, who we are also playing on Saturday. We don't have shared practices all that often. What should we be expecting out of that, and I suppose the game?
It'll be exciting,
Fighting,
right?
Right? We're going to see tons of fights. All the fights. Blake Bortles is going to walk in on water.
Yeah, so Bortles will be Jesus, and Yannick will start a fight or something like that, I'm sure.
Okay, well, thanks for listening, folks.
Yeah. It'll be exciting. The Jaguars are a very colorful team, to say the least. It really sucks that two of the most colorful members are suspended for the week, because it would have been fun to ask Jalen Ramsey about Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. It would have been fun to see kind of what Dante Fowler did against the Vikings offensive linemen. But you don't get them. But you do get the league's like number 2 or number 1 defense, depending on how you measure it. And you get to see them go up against an offense that, is hoping to be and should expect to be kind of in the top 10 in the league, and hopefully kind of start cracking the top 5 with the receivers that they have, the running back that they have, and the quarterback that they paid a bunch of money for. So it'll be nice to see them against a different defense. It'll also be easier for fans to interpret, right? Because holy crap, Kirk Cousins made a play. Does our defense suck? Or holy crap, Mike Hughes has a pick. Does Kirk Cousins suck? You don't have to worry about that. Now when the Vikings do a good thing, it'll be against another team. So it's just unambiguously good. The real interesting thing is kind of what's going to happen against that offense. The offense is not good, in my opinion, but it'll be important to see kind of what the defense does when they're lined up against different players. And this is why I love joint practices so much. I think it does increase maybe the risk of injury, certainly increases the risk of fighting, because you're not in the trenches with these people, so it's probably easier to fight them. But the ability to get different looks and break the fact that you might be even unconsciously leaning on your understanding of a player's tendencies is, I think, really important, because you don't get these during the season either. You practice against your scout team and stuff. And so you have the ability to really get live reps against somebody where it doesn't matter if you win or lose, because it's a practice that you won't necessarily see again and that you haven't seen before. And so that'll create a bunch of unique opportunities for the Vikings to evaluate what's happening. And of course, for fans and reporters and analysts and whatever to kind of break down and talk about.
So Super Bowl preview then?
Yeah, sure.
It makes sense.
Hopefully.
We can only hope.
I said hopefully, knowing that people would interpret that as, hopefully, the Vikings make the Super Bowl. But in my head, I was thinking, God, it'd be hilarious if Blake Bortles made the Super Bowl. That was my first thought. Hopefully it's a Super Bowl preview, because then Bortles would be in it.
You're and then everyone on our line would feast. It would be glorious.
Right.
And Mike Hughes can have 3 pick sixes in the Super Bowl, and it'll be just amazing. That's probably what we should be aiming for anyway. Let's open up the mailbag, shall we? HVAC Repairman asks, what would have to happen for the Vikings to go 1-15?
Well, they'd have to lose 15 games.
I'm thinking that their entire HVAC system would have to collapse and kill the defense.
Yeah, that was
fall out of the ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, critical players would be injured, right? So Kirk Cousins probably injured, and you have to rely on Trevor Siemian. And some players may not be as good as you thought, like maybe Sheldon Richardson's not performing, and Xavier Rhodes is injured and stuff like that. It would take a lot, because if you have the worst team in the league, it's actually still difficult to go 1-15 if you're trying to win, unless you're the Browns. But yeah, you'd have to have bad luck, and you would have to be bad.
Actively bad. I was reading the Why Your Team Sucks for the Bengals, and it was I hadn't actually had a chance to read that one for this season yet, and Deadspin really Drew Magary really put some love into that one. He had mentioned that he had watched the Vikings watched the Vikings-Bengals game because Drew Magary is a Vikings fan from the area. So he had watched that game. I was like, I've never seen a team more checked out in my entire existence. It's like,
yeah, right?
Like, no pulse at all. And yet they brought him back.
I mean, a rumor that he resigned is, contributory. And, maybe that's not his fault. But whatever, man. Just get rid of him.
So Hunter Magnus asks the question, what's your way too early prediction for wide receiver depth chart? I suppose this is where we mentioned that Kendall Wright has been playing like hot garbage.
Until today. He looked great today. It's kind of weird. But yeah, so Thielen and Diggs in some order at the top. Doesn't matter. Behind them, I guess it's Treadwell. I mean, he's been running with the ones. The entire camp. Which is not, determinative. I mean, we've seen players run with the ones for all of camp and then, suddenly they're the second team, whatever, right? Or in Chris Crocker's case, he just got cut, which, holy crap. So, it's not entirely determinative, but let's say, it's Laquan Treadwell. Behind that, I would still cut Kendall Wright, and I would think about, having Tavares King on the roster because he's looked a little bit better, but not great. And then I would say Zylstra is somewhere there. Stacey Coley, if he's healthy enough to be there, is there. And then once Caleb Jones comes back, he should be competing for the 3-4 spot, and maybe you get rid of Tavares King then. And that's a super young receiving core in a way that might make them uncomfortable, but it probably gives you the best 5 or 6 receivers. And then you could have Chad Beebe on the practice squad. And then, honestly, you could take or leave Jeff Badditt and Corey Robertson and Jake Weineke based off their performances thus far.
So not a big surprise at the end of the list anyway.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to our next question, which is from Zen Cupid, who asks, are Hunter's arms even bigger this year? I about did a spit take when the camera showed him on the sidelines. I've heard someone else ask that. Maybe it's you again, but who knows? I've heard it twice now, so maybe there's something there. Next question is from Corey Rug, who asks kind of a simple question, but could be pretty in-depth. Who on our defense are we built around the most?
Man, that is super interesting. The Brett Coleman video that I'll love to share on Harrison Smith might argue that it's Harrison Smith, would be a unique way to construct a defense because the NFL doesn't care about safeties. So that's one option. Otherwise, I would say Barr, but they're not committed to this idea that it is Barr. So maybe it's not. But I mean, it's kind of how the original design of the defense was meant to go. It does kind of rely on how good those cornerbacks are. So I'll say Harrison Smith, then Xavier Rhodes, and then, it's hard to pick a linebacker given how much they don't impact defenses as much as people tend to think, but Barr anyway.
Yeah. Next question is from Corey Rug again, who asks, when you order pizza, do you do the build your own pizza toppings or do you trust the pre-made recipes? I'm a lazy man.
Does it count if you just pick your favorite, but it was your own pizza topping that you did? You made a favorite, and it's not one of the pre-mades, and then you just keep reordering that? No,
I think that counts. I think if it involves a little bit of creativity, albeit you're redoing the same damn thing you tend to be doing, that still counts. I think that still counts. I had friends who every time they ordered pizza after bar, it was pepperoni. It was like a Hawaiian pizza, but then had jalapeno on it. I was like, why are you doing this to yourself? I'm not even against fruit on pizza. I was like, why are you doing this to yourself at 2:30 in the morning? Why? What are you trying to prove? I like spicy food, and it didn't make any sense to me. I tend to go with the pre-made stuff unless it's like a veggie pizza, in which case I'll likely throw chicken on because I'm of the belief that there's no veggie pizza that can't be improved. It's just a little bit of chicken.
I strongly agree with that, and it's not even like Nah, vegetarians. Nah, you got to eat meat. The chicken goes really well with like every veggie topping on a pizza.
It really, really does, especially the veggie deep dish over at Devani's, which I was living off of for a number of years when I was living down in the cities. So I was a big fan of that. I'd throw chicken into that. It'd be great. Next question is from Kenneth Allen, who asks, "Am I crazy, or does Sluter put his whole body into throws? Does he have good mechanics?"
I haven't actually looked at his mechanics from this year's preseason or all that much in camp. But I did note it in the training camp guide that I put out that he's got a looping throwing motion that needs to be tightened up. And so it increases like fumble likelihood. It invites pressure. And that looping throwing motion makes it really easy for you to look like you're putting your whole body in, and B, to actually just like do that, to put your whole body into the motion. Now, really tight throwing motions will also, draw energy from like how you plant your feet. So technically every throw, except for like really weird sidearm throws from Stafford, will bring your whole body in. But when it looks like you're doing that, that's probably a sign that something's not quite clicking correctly, or you don't necessarily have the arm strength to do the thing that you're trying to do, or whatever. But yeah, he's got coming into this preseason, he had a throwing motion that really needed to be tightened up. And when you've got a throwing motion like his, when you do kind of rifle or attempt to rifle a deep ball or try to put a bunch of arm strength on something, you tend to like lean back and arch a little bit, and that makes it look like you're just like heaving with your whole body. So yeah, I guess you're not crazy. That's good news. Again, I can't confirm from what I've seen from this preseason, but yeah, that fits what I know.
It sort of makes sense anyway. Kenneth Allen also asks, what's the deal with the Boone-Thomas battle? It seemed like Boone had the coach's favor before the game, but is the race a lot tighter now, or should we discount Thomas's performance against the threes?
I would not discount Thomas's performance against the threes, and I think it is pretty important to take a look at a running back based off of how they do in situations where people are like allowed to tackle them, because their ability to avoid tackles and create awkward tackling angles and run through people is a key part of their like job description, and you can't really evaluate that in the preseason. Also, Thomas was injured for a good chunk of training camp, so it was very difficult for us to get a good look at what maybe he can do. And Boone and Cook are the kind of running backs where their athleticism will just be obvious. When they cut, it's incredible to watch the different kind of athlete that they are. Thomas is merely an above average athlete at his position. And so it doesn't look special. And so it doesn't stand out when we watch him. Like for Latavius Murray, like at least he's like super tall, and that's weird for a running back. And so he can kind of stand out. But like Thomas doesn't do anything on a practice field that like stands out super obviously when you compare him to the running backs that are currently on the roster. So that might be part of it too. Thomas does not run routes nearly as well as Boone does. Those are things that do show up in a practice environment really well. And so I don't think it was misleading for Boone to get the hype, because people asked questions about him in pressers, and then we got like these surprisingly enthusiastic responses. We talked about it. I would say Thomas is firmly in the lead for running back 3, but it could be just as likely that Boone has a game like he did against Michigan, where he got like 150 receiving yards in this next preseason game. And then we can restart up this discussion. But, yeah, Thomas has, I think, earned primary consideration for that third running back spot.
All right, next question is from Don from Ohio, who asks, any reason the Vikings are not using Kyle Sluter correctly? I know it's only one preseason game, but there's no reason for him not to have had 12 touchdowns on Saturday. Minimum.
It's a good point. I think the Vikings hate him and want to tank his value. So that must be it.
He has it's the opposite effect of the player who just has something on the team and they're not letting him go. It's like, no, we're going to tank you. We're going to ruin all of your value and send you out to some desolate wasteland like Detroit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Detroit. Here we go. This one I've been waiting for.
This is a good one.
Brian Borgen asks, last year we made the assertion, or I made the assertion that Case Keenum was to quarterbacking as turkey was to entree meats. So my question is this, Arif, based
a good take,
on,
by the way.
Arif, based on what you've seen in camp, what meat or overall meal would Kirk Cousins be? I think of him kind of as a chain restaurant like Applebee's steak. Much better than people want to admit, but he's no porterhouse.
A, that's an incredible comp. B, that's a fantastic question. C, I would say I wouldn't go franchise steak. I would say a chicken breast.
Is he like ordering chicken at a steakhouse? Because every time you go to Manny's, they make fun of you for that, or they make fun of you for ordering the fish at the steakhouse too.
Yeah, it could be that, right? Like, the Vikings had a choice between, a bunch of quarterbacks, and, that could be likened to a steakhouse. Maybe they ordered the chicken. That's better than ordering the fish at an inland restaurant, which maybe that's what Case Keenum was in that scenario, or turkey, I guess, more appropriately. But, it's not quite a steak, which I don't know who the steak would be. Teddy, maybe? I don't know. But, I think of him as a chicken breast in particular because a lot of people can screw up a chicken breast, but there's a floor to it when you do. It's dry, but it tastes like chicken. It can be reasonably good. You can
it can be repurposed in the proper system. Right,
exactly. But also, I've had some incredible chicken breast. The skin is crispy, it's seasoned really well, it's moist, it's plump and cooked well and all that. But it's got such a small margin of error that in order to do that, everything has to go right. And I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this then. There's a floor to a chicken breast. You can repurpose that floor to make something good. Say, inside a gravy and a sauce. But you can get a really good chicken. It's never going to be the best meat, but you can get a really good one in the right situation. Boom. I think I knocked that out of the park.
It's not the hero that you deserve. It's the hero that you need.
Yeah.
Really? That's there's some joke about you like that, and I'm just gonna walk away from it. Kyle Slaby asks, if the Vikings were the subject of Hard Knocks this year, which player would get the full 10-minute segment to explain misguided financial advice?
That's interesting. So he asked a follow-up question. Isn't Cantrell Brothers a Bitcoin guy? And no, that's Stephen Weatherly. And also, the answer is Stephen Weatherly. And the reason we know this is because he actually told Vikings reporters last year to invest in Bitcoin. And that was when it was on the upswing. So, boom. There you go. Which is not to say that, I have no idea how Bitcoin's going to do in the future. It's at $6,000. People who bought into it when it was $200 probably still happy. Maybe it explodes in the future or whatever. But the evidence suggests that Stephen Weatherly was catastrophically wrong.
That's too bad. Final question is from Kyle Slaby, who asks, Greg Williams, a diehard 38-7 Eagles fan, are all hanging out with Don from Ohio in his RV. Suddenly, said RV is pulled into a black hole. Lucky for them, you have the technology to save one person. All three people hold a serum to permanently protect Teddy from injury. Who gets saved?
Well, it can't be Greg, because he'll break the serum in his hands as soon as you save him, because that's who he is.
Well, likely somebody paid him to do it, likely himself.
Right. So the question is, do I save a diehard 38-7 Eagles fan? I have no idea what he's going to do with the serum either. Maybe drink it? That would be weird. Let's see what happens.
I get the feeling he wouldn't be able to hang on to it for too long because his hand is used to the greased light poles of Philadelphia. So as a result, maybe his hand isn't, maybe his grip isn't as well. So maybe he's going to end up dropping it. Or that's going to be sucked into the hole.
The other side of that is that our experience with Eagles fans is that they hold on to things for a really long time.
Oh, God, you're right.
Yeah. So, half dozen of one. And then there's Don from Ohio, who constantly harasses us and makes the show worse and makes Vikings Twitter worse and is a bad person.
Wait, hold on here. Why do you hate me enough to have to defend Don from Ohio on this show? Why are you... What the hell did I do to you? Why am I going to have to...
It was important to say that because I know that he's one of the people that listens all the way to the end of the show. I just want to hear what he has to say. Anyway, we saved Don.
It's not even a contest at that point.
Yeah, it's not close.
No, we save Lone Star, and he can fly off in his RV later.
Yeah. Because he's the most likely to use the serum for its intended purpose.
Mm-hmm.
B, I mean, he's by far the best of these three villains.
By far, yes. Even if he is an incredibly annoying fantasy football player.
Yeah, and he makes the show better. He adds content to the show. So, there's a bunch of reasons.
See, this is why you donate to Norse Code, because in the mailbag we will save you. we will put you over wrestling style after donating to the show. We'll say all sorts of nice things about you. So that was a wise move, Don. Congratulations. And I believe that is going to be it for the show. So again, if you have not had a chance yet, please email norsecodepodcast@gmail.com or just send us a quick DM on Twitter, just mentioning that you are interested in joining the Fantasy Football League with the negative 25-point extra point rule. It makes this game fun. It's also the only type of fantasy that should ever be played. Fantasy football is ridiculous, so why not make it more ridiculous and play a game where extra points are negative 25 points? Just saying. Also, if you are interested in donating to the show, you can do so at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and do a monthly subscription there. So, Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, so at zonecoverage.com, you can see my notebook on the offense, which takes into account my observations from the last week of training camp, as well as, the observations from the game itself. So we've got a context to evaluate, what happened in the game and get an understanding of, especially the first team who didn't get that much exposure in the game. And then very soon I'll also have a defensive version of that. Also, and we'll discuss this next week in a lot more detail, I've got a huge announcement that I cannot announce now, but here's a teaser. It's super good news that you'll hear about on Monday if you follow me on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL, or like the next time you download the show, if for some reason you don't follow me on Twitter, but you do download the show.
I get the feeling the people who do not follow you on Twitter but download the show represent a minority of our audience. But Please tune in to next episode. We will have good news, according to Arif. Good news? Yeah, let's go. Good news. Good news. Yeah. So that is going to be it. The game is on Saturday, so please check that out. We will be back next week with a new episode to talk about all of the goings on from the Jags game, the practices, and previewing the next preseason game. So that is going to be it. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you so much for listening, and please tweet that. And we will see you next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.